This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Where we sort of left off, we were actually talking about this Lisbon Ripper thing, and those cases fascinate me. But it's very hard for me to cover cases that are sort of sprawling over. Like that's in Portugal to start with, but then there's these other cases that are mentioned related to the Lisbon Ripper. They're not. They're also not necessarily in the U.S. at all because I don't see a lot of relationship between the New Bedford Highway killings and the Lisbon Ripper case. Did you get any kind of vibe from that it might be the same type of thing?
No, and we, in our last episode, I think that has aired. I feel like we were pretty much on point about that being confusing, but it was part of the overall story that was out there. So it just added some more to a confusing situation.
Yeah. So where we get here is we started with Alex Sesney and just to kind of piece all this together. He is mentioned not just as the murderer of Teresa Stone and being what I would term a serial rapist with probably anger problems, but he also sort of sprawls out into being at one point by John Kelly and Stalk Inc. accused of being the man known as the Maine South Woodsman. And somehow his name ends up in the hat as being the New Bedford Highway killer. And the New Bedford Highway killings are maybe a serial killer, or there may be multiple events. Because of the tight geography and the tight timeline, it could definitely be one person sort of looking at that. It could be one killer. It's definitely not as sprawling as the Jeff Davis 8, I don't think.
Right. The only really clear distinction I found in the New Bedford Highway murders, I think one clear distinction was the two girls who have not been recovered.
Yeah.
Because they were neighbors and knew each other, and they fell into some of the same categories as the other victims, but that was the most clear distinction that I just sort of scratching the surface that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I don't think so. This is my off the cuff summary. I think that we have somebody that we can talk to about this, and I think after talking to them, I will make kind of the final call on. I just want to see if she mentions Alex at all. I don't, or Alex Sesney at all, and if she doesn't, I don't know. I think she would know better than me in some ways, but I definitely think there's the potential there for me to give you. I know you don't like it when I straddle the fence, so we'll talk to her, and then I will tell you if I think he has anything to do with any of this, because this case has been very confusing to follow, starting with Sesney and sort of wandering through everything that he's done. You've made some really interesting observations along the way, but I wanted to wrap this up in today's episode. I don't want to come back to Alex Sesney right now unless something happens down the road. I think we can get enough information together here where we have a pretty good idea. I have one little thing that I still haven't cleared up in my head related to him. And I guess that's really how does he get thrown into the New Bedford thing? I'm pretty sure it's something pretty minor that ends up putting him here. But let's have the interview. Let's bring her on, and once we're done with her, you and I will have kind of a wrap up conversation about all of this. How's that sound?
That's good.
So we decided that we probably needed to consult someone who is really familiar with this case, and sort of how we get there is there's not a lot of coverage of the New Bedford highway killer. I found a really cool book, and I was able to pull together some of the information about the author, and I ended up reaching out to her. This is Maureen Boyle. She's an award-winning journalist who has been a crime reporter in New England for decades. She's earned a number of national and regional awards for her writing and reporting. 3 separate times she's been named the New England Journalist of the Year. Her first true crime book was Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer, and it was honored by the Public Safety Writers Association. She has numerous awards and recognitions for her work as a community reporter, for her feature writing, for her investigative journalism, and she is currently the director of the journalism program up at Stonehill College. She lives in New England with her family. She's been involved in this for many, many, many years. Her undergraduate degree is in journalism, but she got her master's in criminal justice. So I feel like it's a good time to talk to her in this story. Maureen, if you want to say hello.
Yep. Hi there, and thank you very much for having me on, and thank you very much for helping to spread the word about this case.
Yeah, we're very excited to cover this. We kind of came about it in a strange way. This case, well, I wasn't unfamiliar with it, but the way that it came up in our current storyline is I have a fascination with the Connecticut River Valley Killer case. And that's another one of those odd sort of New England area cases. I was actually covering Alex Sesney, who for some reason his name gets thrown in the hat for the New Bedford highway killer case as if they didn't have enough suspects. You know?
Yep.
But I had kind of wondered if with the Connecticut River Valley case, if that stopped because maybe he moved to Massachusetts. So I said a little bit about you there at the beginning. Is there anything you want to add into that as far as your background?
Yeah, well, I was a newspaper reporter for decades, more decades than I would care to admit, mostly covering crime, police and courts. So I was very, very familiar, obviously, with the New Bedford highway serial killer because I was working in New Bedford at the time when the story broke. I was one of the first reporters covering the case, and it was a very intriguing case to start because it was sort of like a slow-moving case. No one really knew that there was a serial killer at work essentially until after he stopped in the city. All the killings had started started around March, April of 1988, and they all stopped in September of 1988. So it was a really short period of time. And while 2 of the bodies were found in July of 88, no one really put it together that they were tied to, that they were linked. It was only afterwards, thanks to a New Bedford detective, that they really started seeing the similarities between the dead bodies and a series of women who were reported missing.
And that's just John, right?
Yeah, John Dextrator, absolutely. He's not since passed away, but he was a superb detective, a nice guy, and was really committed to the case. And he was also one of the first, or one of several, but he was really intrigued early on with some earlier attacks on women in the city who were addicted to drugs and were on the street. And he was wondering even back then, before the killing started, who was doing these crimes against these women. because he knew that individuals who attack and do horrible things to the most vulnerable in a community, eventually they continue, and that type of violence does spread out into a community, and other people will be touched by it. So he was really committed to finding these types of individuals who attack the most vulnerable in a community.
I will say that I know a lot about different serial killings and murders, and I would rank this as one of the most complex investigations that I've ever bothered to do research on because of like a personal interest. But it almost seemed like there was, I don't want to say there was an obsession, but there was a real fire under the detectives in this case. Is that the impression you got?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. It became personal because you have to look at the city of New Bedford. New Bedford is a very small city. It is a very close-knit city. Historic, a lot of history in the city. It's a commercial fishing port. There's a large number of individuals who fish for a living, go out on commercial boats to fish. Most people in the area, they don't leave the area. Large families, it's a very community-oriented city. So
With
that
deep
when
roots.
so when this, very deep roots, very, very deep roots. Individuals in the city the roots go all the way back to the whaling industry. They can go, it goes that far back. So there was a commitment by the detectives because the killings touched everyone. Because everyone, it was like 1 or 2 or 3 degrees from the victims. Everyone knew someone who knew the victims. In two of the believed victims, these are 2 women who have not been found yet. Their remains have not been found yet. One was the daughter of a New Bedford retired police officer, and the other one, her mother was engaged to a Dartmouth police officer. So there was a law enforcement determination to find the 2 missing individuals, and also 2 to find who the killer was and stop him.
They go down a pretty deep journey, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not for a lack of suspects. They sort of have multiple people they hone in on at different times. I don't want to give away the ending of the book because I think some of the audience members would really enjoy this. But if I were to ever think of an Agatha Christie story coming to life, this would be it.
I agree with you, because that's what's so frightening about this case. It isn't that there wasn't any suspects; there were so many suspects, and I think that's what's really chilling. And there's a saying that don't lift a rock unless you're prepared to see what's underneath it, and that's what the detectives were doing. And when they did that, they're seeing this other world that is chilling. And they were also what the community had faced was they started looking over their shoulder, not because they were, petrified that the killer was going to get them, but they were looking over their shoulder like, do I know this person? Is the killer someone I go to church with? Is the killer someone in my family? Is the killer someone I work with? Is the killer someone I've seen at the grocery store? Is it someone that I went to school with? And that is what was really frightening, I think, for everyone in the community, that you don't know who he is, and he could be anyone. And that's what the investigators discovered, that they were getting a lot of phone calls and a lot of tips But there was just such a wide range of tips, and they were discovering that people were looking over their shoulder. And it was also an interesting time to be an ex-husband, because a lot of women were calling to say that the killer was their ex-husband or even their ex-boyfriend, because their ex was very, very strange. So those individuals wound up on a list. They had another list of sex offenders. New Bedford is roughly about an hour away from a pseudo state hospital called the Center for the Sexually Dangerous. It's in Bridgewater. And that is where sexually dangerous individuals are committed by the court to. Some of them have been sentenced for rapes. And when their sentence is up, the prosecutors can go to court and seek they be committed for a day to whenever. I'm sorry, a day to whenever, until they are found not to be sexually dangerous. And during this period of time, there was also some of the individuals from this center were on furloughs, and they were, some of them were in New Bedford.
So they thought those, like, they become their own suspect list at that point.
Yes, and they looked at them. Unfortunately, it was very difficult, number one, to pin down when some of the women disappeared. And two, there was some question about the whereabouts of some of the men who were on furlough at the time, and if they were in the area or if they were locked up or out. So there was some sort of gray area. So it was very difficult for them to rule in or rule out some of those suspects.
Well, the main primary list of suspects they had is wild to me. Like, even when you look at like those who've been committed who were on furlough, if you look at the sex offenders, you can't quite get any weirder than the people who sort of rise to the top of the pile.
Oh, I would agree. The first one of the suspects was an attorney in the city by the name of Ken Pont. He was an individual who overcame a heroin addiction. And after that, he finished his college education and went to law school. Which is wonderful, a wonderful accomplishment. Overcoming addiction is very, very difficult, and he did it. However, during the 1980s, another drug became very, very popular, cocaine, particularly amongst professionals, and he became addicted to cocaine. He was still a lawyer. He was also a deputy sheriff in the community. And here in Massachusetts, deputy sheriffs are kind of different than, the title is different than what it might be elsewhere in the country. In Massachusetts, deputy sheriffs often are process servers. Technically, they can make arrests, but it's the local police departments and the state police who handle the crimes. The sheriffs run the jails in the different counties here. And he was a deputy sheriff primarily to do process serving. And that was part of what he needed to do as a lawyer, because he was primarily did a lot of civil cases. So during this period of time, he became addicted to cocaine and did not want people to know that he was, because he did have a certain level of prominence because he was a lawyer. So he would use some of his contacts from his heroin days, have them buy cocaine for him, as well as some of the women who were addicted and working the streets. They would also buy the coke for him, go to his house, and they would use it all up. And that's one of the reasons why he became a suspect, because he also was acquainted with all of the victims in the case, and he also was displaying some very, very strange behavior, which I detailed in the book. I mean, it's
You did. It's like, it's sort of with him. Interesting is, yeah, he absolutely makes a great suspect just for the connections to everything. But he also, like, it's sort of a wild ride to follow his life and like what is going on in his life. Even though he's a lawyer and a deputy sheriff, he's also sort of bonkers.
Yeah, yes, and it's as if he has a feet in two different worlds, and unfortunately, drugs do terrible things to people's lives, but his mannerisms and his reaction during that period of time to inquiries by the police were really a little bit, I wouldn't say out of character for him, but what they did do was raise suspicions amongst law enforcement. Some members of law enforcement thought that he took a little bit too much interest in the case, but he was not cooperating with authorities. He wanted to know what was going on, but was not being completely honest with his relationships with some of the victims. And he left the area about 2 months after the last victim went missing. So that really got some of the investigators, particularly the district attorney, they were a bit suspicious on that score.
You did a really good job portraying him in the story, and you painted this, viable suspect that he's completely misunderstood, and we do know that ultimately he was never convicted of any of these crimes.
Yeah, and the bottom line is he was a bit of a jerk. That is like a key element in here. He was a jerk to the investigators, and when he was dealing with the media, he was an interesting character, to say the least. What he would do during the investigation, he would call different media outlets, and he would make the rounds in making the calls. And the calls would always start as, this is Kenny Punt. This call is off the record. And some reporters would agree to it, and he would go on and rant and rave and say nothing. And if he did say anything, you couldn't use it anyhow. And sometimes he would do that just to see what was going on with the case. I got a couple of those phone calls, and he would call, and the conversation would go, "Hi, this is Kenny Punt. This is all off the record." And I would say to him, "Well, it's off the record unless you can confess to a crime. If you confess to a crime, it is on the record." And then he would tell me to go, what myself, and slam down the phone.
Oh, man.
Because part of it, I could not in good conscience agree to go on the record with someone if he said that he was a killer or that he witnessed the killing. I had gotten to know just about all of the family members of the victims, and I don't think I could have looked them in the face and say, "Oh no, I can't disclose that conversation because it was off the record. I can't ease your pain because it was off the record." I wanted to make that very clear to him at the time that, if you're truly innocent, got no problems here. But I did find it interesting that he would always hang up on me at that point. He was supposedly very insulted, is my assumption.
It's just striking me that you sort of had a fly on the wall perspective of this story, like being a journalist at the time in the place.
I was going to ask you if you were familiar with him personally, and I guess because he called you, you were.
Yeah, and towards the end, I did go out on the street with him as he was, talking to people. I was doing a piece on him during the election race for district attorney when the then current district attorney was being challenged. And it was interesting to see how he would engage with people and watch as people shied away from him. So that was an interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah. You see, I had been doing stories about heroin addiction and as well as prostitution in New Bedford for a couple of years prior to this, to the murders. So I was familiar with a lot of the women who were heroin addicts and were, I would say, forced because of their addiction to work the streets. And so I was able to look at the women who were addicted to heroin and were walking the streets during that period of time, not as what they were doing, but as people. And all the women who were addicted then came from predominantly middle-class families. Most of them, number of them, lived originally from the suburbs. And they were really nice, funny, lovely women. The women that I knew personally were not the victims, which was a good thing. Unfortunately, some of the women who were, I wish I had known them. And I'll also make it very clear that not all of the victims had charges for prostitution. Some of them did have arrest records for prostitution, but not all of them. What was the unifying factor in all of this is their drug addiction.
Gotcha. And it's such a short period of time, and like window of time, and such a short geographical area. It's so small that in that area. The population today in New Bedford is probably 100,000 people, maybe.
Yeah.
So it would be very difficult for me to see all of that going on and not want to get more involved. You think it's had a long-term effect on you, having done that work?
The case took up a good part of, 88, 89, about 3.5, 4 years of my life. When I was working at the Standard Times for at least 2.5 years, this was predominantly most of what I was covering. There were other stories I was doing, but this was the case that I was obsessed with. It might be a good way to describe it, because I was determined that the killer was going to be found. Honest to God, I never would have. I was determined. Yes, there is an answer here, and each week, each month, as different suspects emerged, I'm sure just like the investigators were thinking, oh, this is who it is. And it was, it's a heartbreaking case. And it's a case that really sticks with you. Yeah.
How long would you say, so these cases, they have sort of this distinct characteristic where pretty much all of the women, by the time they were being found is when they were starting to be noticed that they were missing, right, by law enforcement.
Yes.
And it's a very compact period of time where they went missing and they were killed and they were dumped. And I'm curious, because you were working it then and covering it, how long did it take you did you think like any day more bodies could be found, or, it could start again?
Yes, I did.
And I bet, and knowing that because you had been on the streets and you knew some of the people that might possibly be involved, in this type of situation, I imagine that took a toll.
Yeah, it was really, there's a lot of very long days. The paper I was working for, the Standard Times in New Bedford, at that time, that was an afternoon paper. So I would be starting work around 6:37 in the morning, and The paper would come out in the afternoon. So I'd be on deadline in the morning, and then I'd go out and do more interviews and would pretty much work until into the night and then start all over again the next day. So it was a very intense time. And it was, I think it was a very sad time for a lot of people in the community
And
because
that really
nobody,
comes through in the book. You said that you knew some of the ladies that you encountered on the street, but you didn't know they weren't the victims.
no,
But
they weren't.
some of the victims you wish you had known. And honestly, after reading the book, I wish I had known some of the victims. I feel like you did a very good job bringing them to life, so to speak, and really giving them, because it makes it made me really sympathize and empathize not only with the victims but their families as they're going through this.
Yeah, and during that period of time, let's remember in the 1980s, there wasn't a lot of resources for, particularly for women addicts. So those who wanted help, it wasn't available right away. And unfortunately, for one of the victims, she had been locked up in Rhode Island. She was on a work release program in Rhode Island and was originally from Massachusetts. And she was up for parole. And she was really excited because she was at that point in her life of, I am clean. I am going to stay clean. I am going to be committed to my family. And one of the conditions of her release was that she'd be able to get into a treatment program near her mother's home, which was in Brockton. And there was nothing available for her. And it looked like there wouldn't be anything available for her for quite some time. And she was so despondent. She walked away from the work release program she was in and made her way into New Bedford. And that was the last place that she was seen.
That's
And
so tragic.
it is. It really is. And there was another woman who she became addicted to heroin much later in her life. She had two children. She got addicted to drugs thanks to a boyfriend, and she became addicted very, very quickly. So it shocked everyone in her family because she came from a very much a middle class family, hardworking family. Her sister worked for the city. Everyone in her family was very, very committed to doing the right thing. They were not. There wasn't drug use in the family, and she went down that rabbit hole of heroin, and I call it a devil drug, and it just got her in its grasp, and she vanished one night walking home. They did have a really firm timeline on her, so they knew exactly what day she disappeared. And it is her case that really started the investigation going because
Is that Nancy that you're talking about?
Nancy Paiva, John Dextrator, learned about her disappearance when her boyfriend came in to report her missing. And her boyfriend was well known to police, and he was very surprised to see him in a police station. And he eventually got in touch with Nancy's sister. And John started investigating the case. And that's when he discovered that there was a number of women who were missing in the city with similar backgrounds. And most of them had very, very similar characteristics in addition to the drug addiction, height, weight, that type of thing. And then he started doing some more research into it and realized, okay, there was two women who were found dead. Are they any of these missing people? And you have to also put yourself into the 1980s, 1988. A lot of things were not computerized. So there was the start of a computerized list of missing persons, but not all missing persons were on the list. And there was also some issues early on with the first two bodies that complicated the identification of the first two victims. But there wasn't people didn't have most people did not have cell phones in their pockets. The cell phones of that day, the average person would have a bag phone in their car, but smartphones were not a thing. The Any type of surveillance video in a community, they're very grainy and not very prevalent. And the women were all found off of highways that you would only find the bodies if you stopped in that particular spot and walked into the brush. If you're driving by, you would not see them. So there was a lot of things that were going on during that time.
Yeah, so we've got nine victims here and 2 missing people to
Yes.
make 11 that you look at in this book. You did a fantastic job of covering them. I think am I reading this right? That it published
2017. The book came out in 2017, and I know that there's a lot of work has still been going on with the case since that time, and I try to stay abreast of what's going on with it. And if anyone has any information, please contact the Bristol County District Attorney's Office in New Bedford and ask for the cold case unit.
And how long did you spend writing the book?
Well, I could say 30 years,
Sure.
but no, it took me about 2.5 years to write.
Of course, it was in your head the entire time, I'm sure. I mean, everything about the case that you lived through.
Yes, I knew how I was going to start it. I wasn't certain how I was going to end it, but I knew how I was going to start it. And what the funny thing about it is, I thought I knew everything about this case when I started doing the researching it, because I was there, I was covering it, but the more I dug and the more information I received, I learned that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than anyone realized in the case. There are some people in the general public who are saying, well, this is a case where no one cares about them because of the victims. They dropped the ball. They weren't really investigating the case, but they were. They convened a grand jury in the case, and some of the things that were going on behind closed doors in the grand jury, we didn't know about. And I discovered that they did look at a number of suspects in the grand jury, and they did present testimony involving other suspects before the grand jury. And it was not all just about Kenny Pah.
I think you also did a good job when it came to kind of spelling out some of the other people that were in front of the grand jury. You did a fantastic job. That was one of the first times I've ever seen an author do that. I see a lot of cherry picking where they kind of want to steer the story. You didn't steer the story at all. You left it kind of exactly like the story is in the real world in 2022.
Yes. And I felt that was important to do because life is not, black and white. There's always a gray area in every single case. Nothing is simple. And people like to make, particularly true crime, make it very simplistic. It happened this way, and there's, you don't veer off at all. But when cops investigate crimes, particularly murders, there is a lot of information that's conflicting, a lot of witnesses, their testimony doesn't quite match up, and that's a good thing because people misremember things. And that's what I was really hoping to present to people. And that's also one of the reasons why I wrote the book. one of the main reasons was to really put a renewed spotlight on the case, and number two, to make sure that people have a true accounting of what happened in 1988 and who the victims were and who the investigators were and what they did during that time and what the families went through. That these are people. We have a tendency when you read or hear about true crime, you think of it as a quote unquote case. But it's more than just a case. These are people. These are lives. These are your neighbors. These are people that you may work with. This could be you. This could be your family. And I try really hard in any of my writing to make that known to the public, that this is not a genre. This is life. And
Yeah, you got biographical details in there that I don't think a lot of people understand what it takes to get there. Like when you mentioned Nancy and the fact that Frankie came into the police station and John sort of took an interest in him more than Nancy because he didn't know what was going on. The whole story that you tell around that and getting to the sister has a very real historical fiction feel to it that I feel like you probably got from interviews and a lot of thinking and a lot of working.
Yes, and I also was working at that time, and John had told me that story on multiple occasions, and so did Judy. And I really could not have done this book without the cooperation of the wonderful families and the investigators. All of them were just so gracious in, because I'm picking at an old wound. But, they've been living with it for so long. And I was just so grateful that they allowed me to look into their world. And, and this is something that they haven't forgotten. Even
Of course not.
later, this is, I'm not reopening things because it's still very fresh in their minds.
And it is possibly, it could be a way to bring some closure. I felt like, so we talk about how sometimes victims are marginalized, and a lot of times drug users and sex workers, they end up, they're not as interesting to investigators. You were able to really convey that in this case in New Bedford, there were investigators that were very interested in what was going on and seeking answers, and they were working really hard to bring the families closure. And I'm curious, so with all the research I've done, a lot of times when it is a victim set that they just haven't taken an interest in, that explains why the case ends up not being solved. But in this case, there was so much work put into it. What do you think the gap was there as to why it didn't end up being solved?
Part of it had to do with, I think, with forensics. Because the bodies had been out there for so long, a lot of potential evidence was gone.
Right.
And because in some of the cases they could not pinpoint the moment someone was last seen, because by the time that they knew the person was missing or dead, how do you backtrack? How do you, say to someone, okay, where were you in August of 1988? We're not exactly sure of the day, but, did you see, so-and-so?
Right, and that's just a guess at the very best, right?
Yeah, and some of the potential witnesses did not have they didn't have calendars with them.
Sure.
Some of the victims, when I was reading reports of how they were able to pinpoint, when they last had seen a particular person, a particular victim, it would be, one woman said, well, I know the last time I saw so-and-so, it was, this specific date. No, she didn't even give the date. It was the day I got sent to Framingham. And Framingham is a state prison for women in Massachusetts. So they were able to at least get one date by looking at that woman's record to see when she was sent to Framingham. Or some,
Because she is able to associate it. I see.
yes, or other ones would say, well, the last time I saw her was on this date because that's my kid's birthday, and I called home to say happy birthday.
Right.
Or was my mother's birthday, so I called to say happy birthday to my mother. And so they had specific dates because the dates resonated with them.
Right.
And then the police would have to go back to figure out what exactly that date was.
I love when people open a book with a timeline, and you did that here, and then you dropped us right into the middle of the story. Was that a choice, or was that just where in your head?
No, well, the timeline in the beginning was, I have to say, that was my editor's suggestion, Steve Hull. He said, there's so many characters in here, and there's so many dates. We need a timeline. And it's that I understand completely because, there's the dates of when people went missing, the dates that they were found. And they conflict because some of the women who went missing, they weren't found until months and months and months later. The last remains were found were in April of 1989. And that woman went missing in 1988.
Right.
So it's a very confusing timeline for the average person.
I admire you for tackling it because it's one of those things where I can see how the frustration would grow over the years, whether from the investigative perspective or even from the investigative journalist perspective, which is very much you here. I would throw my hands up multiple times that you keep going.
Oh, it was difficult, but when I was first covering the case, I was obsessed with it. I have to admit that, decades later, I just couldn't let it go, and I was just drawn back to the scenes. At one point, just to relax, I would get in the car and drive by some of the scenes at the spots on the highway where the women were, just thinking, well, is there something here that I'm missing or that we're all missing in terms of where the bodies are? And there's something, there's an answer here that we're not getting.
Yeah, in your search for answers, you do a pretty good job covering the different suspects or the different primary suspects. I was curious. So you've had a little bit of time since the book published, and now we're a couple years out. Has anything sort of went off since then where you feel more strongly about a particular suspect or set of suspects, or is there anything that's changed there for you?
No. No, because this is advice that was always given me by investigators, by cops, is, you don't rule anyone out.
Right.
You can rule people in, but don't rule anyone out. Because if you do that without, hard facts, you can go down the wrong road. And I am convinced that the answer to who the killer is someplace in one of those police reports. And once they identify who the killer is, they're going to look through them and go, hey, we interviewed him, or hey, his name is here, or his name is there. It'll be one of those, Monday morning quarterbacking that yeah, but we didn't know. but it will be interesting once this is all resolved. It really will be.
That's all I have on shallow graves. Meg, do you have anything else here?
I have one more question, and John, you can cut this out if you don't want it included. But I read the book, but I also listened to the audiobook while I was doing chores around the house. And one of the thing that stuck out in my mind, I think the most, or it caught my attention and it made me want to ask you, was there is the scenario in the book. It's talking about Nancy's daughter and how Frankie showed up and she didn't want him to be there. And she was like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And he's like, "Well, your mom's in rehab." And he's lying to her, right?
Yep.
And what kind of sent off a red flag in my head was, he had already gone to the police and reported her missing. Why didn't he ask her daughter if she had seen her?
I know.
I thought that was just, I was like, that seems not right.
And that's what her sister thought that was not right. And her daughter didn't think that was right. It was that he was lying. He would later say that, he didn't want to, get them worried. And, he thought that she just took off to get away from him. But she would have let the girls know, and she wouldn't have left her youngest behind. So it was that was a very large red flag to Nancy's family, and they could not understand why he was lying.
Yeah, I thought to myself, it seems like that would be the very first question you would say is, have you seen your mom? I can't find her, because he was so panicked enough that she was gone, and he went to the police and filed a missing persons report. But then when it came to her daughter, he's like, "Oh, she's in rehab."
Yeah.
And so, that it left a taste in my mouth. And that resonated with me, because I was like, that just didn't make any sense.
No, it did not make any sense. It did not make any sense to her family, and it didn't make any sense to the police.
So you have a master's in criminal justice, right?
Yes, I do.
Did you get we have this other thing that sort of ties in here. I just want to ask you this from more the criminal justice perspective and all of your years of experience. Did you get the vibe that this could have been an 18 or 19-year-old kid?
No.
Yeah, I didn't either. So that's how we got here. There's a district attorney in another area who threw the name of a kid that would have been 18 turning 19 while this was happening. He throws his name in the hat and tries to, much later in 2008, he tries to hang the idea of him possibly being a New Bedford Highway killer on him. And, one of those true crime talking heads pops up and sort of backs that up. And we were one of the things that we do is we ask questions about what's presented in the mainstream media. That's the biggest thing we do at True Crime Excess. You've definitely helped us sort of have a better understanding of the New Bedford Highway killings, even though there's not a conclusion there. I mean, I think it's fair to say that's an unfinished story.
No, it's interesting when you brought up that, an 18, 19-year-old, if that is someone who is living in Massachusetts, that individual, if it's the same person we're both thinking of, he had been stopped in along Route 140 in Freetown way back when, during the time of the killings, for speeding, I believe. And he was in the area with his brother, and his brother was older than him. So, that is still, out there someplace, because that individual did have a later history of rape convictions, among other things.
Interesting.
So I that guy's name was also in the back of my mind in more recent years.
Yeah, I've not been able to rule him out, but generally speaking, he's committed some really odd crimes later on, but I've never really figured him for the type of serial predator that I think you guys were dealing with, particularly in New Bedford, because that's a quick period of time to take a lot of people's lives,
Yeah.
and it's incredibly tragic. I appreciate you coming on to talk to our audience. Is there a place that you prefer that people pick up your books? The best place?
The best place would be either Barnes and Noble. You can get barnesandnoble.com and Amazon
Okay.
for either of my books, Shallow Graves, A Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer, or The Ghost, the Murder of Police Chief Greg Adams, and The Hunt for His Killer. Both of them are available on both of those sites, or you can order them through your local bookstore.
Cool. I appreciate you coming on with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I like talking to her. I like having a journalist that we know that, and I think we should bring her back on. There's some other stuff that I know she's covered. What did you think of that conversation?
Well, she got to experience it like really firsthand when it was happening, right? And we're talking about back in the 80s. And she was covering it, from a firsthand point of view. She's not researching it like we are. And I enjoyed having the conversation with her.
Yeah, she was right there in the mix. One of the things I liked about her writing for this book, and I will go ahead and tell everybody, you should definitely read the book if you're into true crime books. It is complicated to read, and the reason it's complicated is because it's pretty real. It's pretty firsthand, like you described, but it's also, I think she did a really good job with the perspective of like the detective in this story who had all these questions about whether or not this was a serial case. And I think it mirrors some of the things that we do, because I like to get in way over my head and go, I think there's a serial killer here, and run with it. And that's not what happened in this case. It was more like, well, if this is happening, what else is happening? And then, turning over a leaf, and then turning over another leaf, and turning over another leaf, and then the body's being found and going, well, what was that? And that's a really sort of authentic take on what happens in a lot of serial cases. We've seen it mirrored in a lot of true crime things. New Bedford Highway Killer is not talked about as much, and it's still unsolved. Those cases are unsolved. And I think from your observations over sort of the course of this and from what she was saying, and if you do read the book and you dig in, you'll see some of these suspects could all be responsible for pieces of this. And that could be why it's so complicated. I think I can say now that we've talked to her and we've done a lot more work than is going to make the air in this case, because a lot of what we were doing here was sort of ruling things out. And I will say that anyone who attaches Alex Sesney's name to a serial case like the New Bedford Highway Killer doesn't know as much as they think they do about serial cases. Did you have an opinion on that part?
Well, you had said earlier that you felt like he may be a serial rapist, right?
Definitely. I don't think he's a serial killer.
And I'm not even sure he's a serial rapist. He could be, definitely. He could be a serial killer. We could be all wrong, but I haven't seen the signs I typically look for when we're talking about a genuine serial killer. And I have trouble with the whole serial rapist thing because, from a legal standpoint, ultimately his rape conviction and the first degree murder conviction, the rape conviction got kicked, right? And we talked about pretty in depthly how we felt like it if the prosecutors had sort of argued a different angle, that may not have happened, right?
Yeah.
They might have been able to keep him from having the rape conviction overturned, but that's not what occurred. And then the other case that he was charged, and it was a he said, she said, which at the very most, from my understanding of that situation, that would have been like a date rape case, right?
That's sort of how it was presented in the court.
And
Yeah.
and so he was acquitted of that, right? Which means that there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that he did it. And so I even have trouble going, well, how is a serial rapist, somebody that has their rape conviction overturned and then gets acquitted of rape charges? And it's a big mess.
Well, so Alex Sesney does have. You're right, though. Like, even if I go through to defend my words there,
Which I'm not
he
saying
has a
you
criminal.
necessarily have to, because I feel like your perspective is fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying, like, I'm having a really hard time quantifying this guy Alex Chesney as any sort of uh like notable criminal at all.
Yeah, I mean, he does. He has a criminal record, but you're right. If you look at how the things were pled out and how things were sort of adjudicated along the way, ultimately, it's not super interesting. I went through and I tried to determine if there was anything else that we had kind of missed with this case, and ultimately, I don't think that we did. I will say that um, there was a pretty interesting federal filing in this case. Sometimes I get into Pacer and I sort of go down a rabbit hole with what shows up in there, which is it's sort of different because, in case the audience isn't aware, with federal courts, you typically don't have any kind of audio or video in a federal court. You sort of have to rely on the paperwork in those cases, and paperwork can be dry. I did find a filing by Alex Sesney where he was looking for habeas relief on even more grounds than what we covered in the first round of things. And I haven't like looked at his case and gone, there's something in here that makes me think he's a serial killer. There's something in here that makes me think he's a serial rapist that I could prove. But I'll say it this way. I don't think he's the New Bedford highway killer. And she did mention him. I don't know if you caught that, but she mentioned the speeding ticket. So
Right.
she was also aware of that, and I had heard the same thing. Now I don't have a source for that. Like I don't have a second source for that. But she, I think, was thinking of the same things I was, which was it was him and a brother or him and a cousin that were pulled over, and that's what put them there in the time frame, like close to sort of where the New Bedford stuff happened. But he would have been very young. You're talking he would have been 17 turning 18 during that time.
Right. And I see where, you can draw the conclusions from that. It's just it for me, it just ended there. And I think if you go chronologically backwards, right?
Yeah.
So you're talking about what we know is, he was convicted of first degree murder in I think 2008 of a 1996 case, right?
Yeah.
So it was like way later. But if you go chronologically backwards and you think about, the Maine South woodsman serial killer, what's purported to be a serial killer, and then you go on back to the New Bedford Highway serial killings, it doesn't completely. The only thing that's in common really is just his timing there, because he was a murderer, because he was found guilty of that murder. He was a murderer who uh, you know escaped or eluded justice for 12 years, right?
Yeah.
um But if you think about that case, he left her where she laid, basically. There was no dumping or anything like that. And it's really different than all these other cases. And I know I had trouble because they are so similar as far as the type of victim that is involved and sort of the sporadic dumping and then finding of the bodies, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I haven't seen now, and it could exist, and I just may not have come across it. I haven't seen where that would line up with Alex Chesney at all. Like, as far as I do think that he frequented prostitutes. I do think that he probably attacked a lot of women that he dated, right?
Yeah.
Where you have this like um, kind of questionable encounter with someone you're dating, but like I've said before, people uh, serial killers don't kill the women they date, right?
Yeah.
And he was just not a nice guy, and that is seen, in the case that sort of brought everything else to light that he is ultimately acquitted of, because it's a situation where somebody he was with, a female he was with, said that he sexually assaulted her, and he said it was consensual, and it just went back and forth, and there was no evidence that he did in fact assault her. And so, that sucks in that case. But I bet there's lots of cases of women who didn't come forward in his case. Now, what does that make him? Well, it makes him not a nice guy, right?
Yeah.
And the whole, I don't know that it would rise to the level of being a serial rapist without, more people coming forward. But I do think it's just a proximity type assessment. And I feel like, without like a whole bunch more information, it isn't enough for a murderer who killed a single woman. And I'm not saying this to like put down her murder, but like he committed a murder, and in my opinion it was almost more of a crime of passion type thing, like he was angry, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't feel like that's enough just because he eluded justice for 12 years until his DNA matched. I don't know that that's enough to link him to all that stuff. And I feel like that's all they had to go off of. Now, you did mention he had gotten a ticket in the area, and I understand that, but that's still, to me, like, how close was it? How many times was he in that area, right? It could have been he could have traveled through there once a month or something, right? I don't know, but to me, it's just not. I don't think he's going to be dumping bodies in the 80s and then leave a victim where she lay in the 90s, right? And
Yeah.
then go back to dumping bodies again? I mean, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, and we were, because of the way that other trial went, where he's acquitted of the later case. We don't have a record that we can sit down and pour through, and that acquittal means like we don't really know if that victim might have been more than just a sexual assault. Like we don't know if she was, because your theory was that she escaped, or maybe.
Well, okay, and you're right. I did say that. And the reasoning behind that was like, if this is the serial killer, right? And she was attacked by him, but she didn't die, she had to have escaped.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree 100% with you. That's why I'm mentioning it here, is because you were pretty clear that like that would be an important distinction and it would be an important fact. And I don't have it. Like I've looked for it. I found sources that go both ways, so I don't know which one's correct.
And so, though he was acquitted of it, I feel like his 1996 encounter, where he essentially had sex with a female that he then brutally killed, right? I think that it very easily could have escalated to her being killed, right? But she wasn't killed. And I don't know how often he escalated that situation. And we can't even say that he raped her because he was acquitted of it. Right? I'm talking about the 2006 or 8 case. I keep
It's
getting the numbers.
2006. Yeah, I know which one you're talking about. It's the motel case is what I called it. Well, I'll say this: you brought up something in the course of investigating this that I think it's important to mention, and why I am leaning the way that I'm leaning. You pointed out that Teresa had been probably thrown from a vehicle. Now, it's not stated that anywhere.
Or jumped, right?
Or jumped, yeah.
Because of the way that her injuries were, they were consistent with like a pretty damaging blow to like one side of her entire body, which would be like, hitting the ground after you've been thrown or jumped from a vehicle. Yeah.
Yeah. And so if that's the case, and I believe that it's more likely than not that it is the case, I have a different perspective on how even that murder went down. It's still murder, but that is.
But it leads away from him being a serial killer, right?
Yeah. So that's more like putting down a wounded animal. That's a terrible analogy, but that's not, you don't have the same chutzpah that a serial killer has. Like a serial killer hunting and killing is not the same thing as, oh, this woman jumped out and now she's seriously injured and I've raped her and now I'm going to kill her. That's not the same type crime.
Well, and I don't even know that he completely processed the whole "I'm going to kill her" thing, rather than like just he was in a rage.
Yeah.
And I mean it's called a crime of passion because that's exactly what it is. And but it has like serial killers. I mean, they might kill in a rage, but it's not this type of rage. It's not somebody they picked up and could have had a consensual encounter with and went on about their day, right?
Yeah.
That's not how, serial killers typically work. But it is situations where frustrated people can not get their way and then overreact.
Yeah. So I think he definitely could be a frustrated person who overreacts and does stupid things that are violent and awful and evil, but they aren't set out to be violent, awful, and evil. They're just out of his lack of ability to control himself, and that's different.
Have you thought about like how, and I haven't looked into this because I feel like it would be very depressing, but have you thought about the general sort of attitude towards females? Okay, for one thing, in the 80s. This would be going back to the New Bedford Highway cases. But so, just sort of a misogynistic or chauvinistic type attitude towards women, and then like amplified on the fact that like, some of the women were sex workers or they did drugs. And I assume when they're saying they were sex workers, like they exchanged sex for drugs, right?
Or money. I mean, one or the other, but the ultimate end goal was like to get the drugs.
Right. And so, were they really that discardable, by the men who possibly were doing this? And I don't know what the attitude was back then. And, I know that it has over time evolved to be less misogynistic and chauvinistic, but because there's clearly something wrong happening with all of these that have been set up to be like a serial killer. And there's a lot of similarities that run between the New Bedford Highway murders and the Maine South Woodsman murders, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And so while it makes logical sense that there's like at least one, possibly more than one guy out there that's killing or dumping prostitutes who are using drugs, right? I mean, that's how you sum it up, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you're asking me if I guess we would say very cautiously the value of people who engage in high risk trades like that, if that has changed or if it's the attitudes that have changed, I don't know that I have an answer there. I think it's some of both.
Well, and I guess my point is like, is it possible that there were that many men that really disregarded them enough to, just, do some drugs and have sex with them and then dump their bodies?
I mean, to some like that's another thing. So I personally view that as sex work has changed with the evolution of the internet.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I agree with that.
Access to other people has changed with the evolution of dating on the internet. So uh, I was a part of like the 90s internet where there were telnets and usenets. And for a while, there was sort of this peaking of, what's going to be legal on the internet. Because there were like places you could go where people were talking about, sexual activity and fetishes and stuff like that. There were no pictures at the time. There were like, it was like a bulletin board style system. And you might come across one looking for something else. Because the biggest thing the internet was like, for me, the biggest thing was I could talk to my friends in the mid early 90s that were at other colleges like in real time, not having a phone bill. Because that's another thing that changed is the accessibility to talk to people in other locations phone wise is no longer attached to a long distance bill. It's no longer attached to, having to find a phone. Pretty much everybody has a phone or can get a burner phone. And that all of those things changing has just changed the demographic of the customer for sex workers. And I think it's mainly been in a positive way because I think people who would view sex workers as discardable, the largest percentage of those people who had that were trying to fill a different void. And they weren't really there because like I have a friend that does see sex workers and it's not my thing. I don't understand it, but he will occasionally tell me something he heard a celebrity say, which is he's not paying them for whatever, he pays them to leave. And he does not
What?
like the money is not for their services. Their money is so that when he wakes up and has to go do his next thing, they're gone. He's not having a relationship with them. He's paying for their services. And he's not picking people up off the street.
No, I
Like he's
understand. I am
like
so confused by that because
so but I'm just saying that's a very different attitude than I think what you would have if you were picking up someone off the street to do something in a car or to go do drugs with them or something.
right, and I think so to get into the minds and sort of get that perspective of uh what would be going through a typical sex workers customer in when these New Bedford highway murders were happening, and like what are the chances that any one of those men or women or whoever's picking them up could just say I want to do something that they didn't like and have them jump out of the car and end up pinning them down and assaulting them and then killing them, right? And I don't know. I feel like I'm probably trying to categorize it too much because I can't even say now. I would say like in the place I live, if all of a sudden there were a bunch of I live in a town that has like 4,000 people, okay? And if all of a sudden there were a bunch of women being at least their bodies are being found, whether they've been murdered or dumped, I feel like I don't feel like there's that many guys here in this area that could be doing it, right?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. And in
Okay,
2022, I would agree with you.
sure. And so that's kind of where I'm going. Like, did they think at that point in time, was it the mindset that like there can't be that many guys doing this, right? And it stopped, and there's this short period of time, and that gives credence to a serial killer, right?
It does. It does. And that probably went on in the U.S. for about 40 years. I would say from the late 50s to the early 90s was sort of that golden age of what you're describing happening. If it could, I don't know what the opposite of a golden age would be, where it's a terrible time, but it would be that.
The rusted age.
Yeah.
It's not funny, but I feel like all those things need to be taken into consideration. And because he didn't become a person of interest until the 2006, right?
Yeah, 2006 to
Um,
2008, he becomes a person of interest in one crime that leads to a DNA swab lending into another crime, and then suddenly he's on all these lists.
And so I think that that gap, which he was a murderer who eluded justice for 12 years, right? Okay, that's established. Um, I don't know that he was ever hiding, right? I don't feel like he ever thought he was going to be caught for this. I don't think that he was ever a suspect. Um, and so because it was so much later, I think by 2008 we had profilers who were going, wait, there's all these murders that are of women who may have been sex workers or may have been looking for drugs, and like this guy is in that area and he killed this one woman and he eluded it for all this time, right? And I think that they go, oh well, then it's got to be him, or he's a great suspect, right?
Yeah, that could be what it is. I mean, so it's not that I. So I'm just going to go ahead and say he did not do the New Bedford highway killings and
There's no question.
then leave a body on the side of the road with all his stuff on it with Teresa Stone. That's the opposite of what you would see, because the murder of Teresa Stone being a rage killing, it could be an exception in the middle of like a serial killer's career. It's unlikely. You're not going to leave her there.
No, and he's not gonna have been seen with her. He's not gonna have this ongoing repertoire with her, like was said that he did. And I personally feel like Alex Hesney did kill, and that's established in court. The rape conviction was overturned. Legally speaking, I don't know that I'm not going to say he didn't rape her. I'm just going to say the court has said that the conviction for the rape was improper, right? And they vacated it. But it doesn't matter because he's still guilty of first degree murder and he'll be in jail, right? I feel like while he more than likely is what you say, as far as like this, you said a serial rapist, probably a lot of those attacks have gone unreported just because it's more of a date rape situation.
Yep.
And so you're not wrong in that. However, he is not a serial killer. I feel like everybody that says that is doing all these women who have died a disservice, because it marginalizes how the cases are looked at. Don't you think?
Yeah, that was the whole reason for highlighting this series of cases. And it marginalizes it, but it also sort of halts the investigation and the resource going towards those cases. So when you hear that somebody, for instance, like Maureen or Carlton, the other gentleman who's covered this, like when they're covering these cases, it's because as people, they're offended that this case is not like solved and it's not talked about. And like she even said she was confused as to like how the coverage was going of it. And she really had to dig into it to figure out that like the reason there wasn't a lot of coverage was because the cops were sort of testing the theory. Is it a serial? Is it not? And the guy, John, the cop she's describing there, he's trying to stop future things from happening by figuring out past things. And honestly, he's not even sure what he's dealing with.
Right. And I do think that he had the right approach there while it was happening in real time, right?
Yeah, and that's where you're investigating these cases individually and you're trying to figure out if the commonalities you're seeing are real. But I don't. So while I agree with that, John, we'll call him John D. I don't agree with talking heads like John Kelly, who sort of retroactively try attaching people to different things. That gets, I think that's where it gets hurt, because we're in the time of, you call it an avalanche. At this point, it's a full blown blizzard. All these DNA cases coming up, and being able to solve things. I've seen cases where after they run DNA, suddenly 5 murders that were thought to have been a single serial killer are actually 5 separate killers.
It happens, absolutely.
And seeing that makes me like look at these cases, and I think aspects of them are solvable. I think you're not going to find in the New Bedford, I don't think there's going to be a lot of DNA there. I don't know that, like, you could probably link, and she sets this up pretty well in the book. You could probably link certain murders to certain suspects and have a pretty good overview of what's happened. Then it becomes like, well, it's 3 serial killers. Well, is it, or is it 3 assholes? Because like really what you have is 3 people who are killing disposable people. And that goes back to your question of like, how do we differentiate, what happened then and what happened now? And I throw in the internet. But the truth is, I don't think we can link Alex Sess into any of it. And I think I actually think it's irresponsible on behalf of the victims for talking heads like John Kelly to do things like that. And that goes for Maine South and New Bedford, all of it.
And I agree with you. I just want to say that, like, I'm not so sure it could have been perceived in 2008 as being irresponsible yet. I think it's taken quite a bit of time for us, especially you and I, like investigating things and seeing what we see the way we see it. I think it's a special set of circumstances that allows us to be able to look at things the way we do. Don't you think?
Yeah, it is. And if I felt more strongly about it, I would lambast John Kelly much more. I'm not doing that because that's why I use I feel like it's irresponsible on behalf of the victims, as opposed to like the idiots in the Texas Rangers that ran around with Otis Toole and Henry Lucas, reading case files for years.
Well, and if the cases, if John Kelly's profile and everything that happened there, if that had led to a legitimate solving of the cases, we wouldn't even be talking about this, right? And so
absolutely,
I do think that it lessens it. And I will be really honest with you. The New Bedford highway killings and the Maine South Woodsman killings, they are confusing. Okay. They're confusing from all kinds of angles, so much so that I get them sort of mixed up in my head. All right.
Oh, yeah.
Now, how is it even possible where you've got all these victims, right? I don't even know what the total was, but you've got all these victims mixed up in your head. Like, it's the narrative that's out there that you have to get through to get to all the different cases separately, because I don't get victims mixed up. You know what I mean? Like it's
pretty rare. Yeah.
It's weird for me to not be able to get a good handle on it, but the information that's available, it's just reflecting they're looking for a serial killer. It doesn't dive into like each individual case like it would need to be looked at. And that's why I get it confused. But it's been a bizarre experience for me. Now, Shallow Graves did do a really good job. It brought light to each of the different victims, right? But that's not what is necessarily being covered, like, if you look mainstream, right?
Absolutely.
Actually, there's hardly anything mainstream.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabbratiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabbratiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
Well, that's why I dug into it as sort of as long as I did, was because I wanted to know if all of it was as confusing to you and potentially to an audience as it was to me. However, when I go back and look at like the Phantom murders in Texarkana, when I look at the Zodiac, when I look at Green River, when I look at even the Atlanta child murders, there are elements of each of those that are very similar to the confusing parts of New Bedford and Maine South. And all of them, have different outcomes. Like the Zodiac is sort of always in limbo. Green River is now pretty neatly wrapped up, whereas the Atlanta child murders was thought to be wrapped up, and then you look at it and it's weird. But my point is, this is how serial cases look. There is no art and there is no science to figuring all of this out. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming next. So next week, we have an update in an old case that is the weirdest update because it may not even be related. It may just be a geography thing, but we're going to talk about that next week. It actually ties to two cases. Did you realize that? That it tied to two things we've talked about along the way?
I'm not sure, actually.
Because we had that whole busted Colorado thing we did, so the reason that we're coming to a close on Alex Sesney is because there's not much else to offer you. And I, as we proved with me chasing things in Colorado a while ago, I will sometimes go on dozens of episodes worth of rabbit hole hunts and take people with me. But instead of doing that, we're actually going to wrap up a little bit, something that involves one of the Colorado cases we talked about, and then also involves Vermont. The Vermont FBI, to be specific. So we're doing that. We're going to do a Halloween episode. I have one unsolved child murder I want to cover. I don't normally like to do those, but we're going to cover that. So we've got the unsolved child murder. We've got a Halloween episode. We've got sort of an update episode. And I guess as we get close to Thanksgiving, we're going to talk a little bit about Israel Keys, about some of the things that we're doing related to Israel Keys. I'm not 100% sure we're going to get cleared on that because it has to do with things that are really old being marked as open and under active investigation.